Hello, my name is Nash Turley, and this is my tutorial on macro photography. So I'm into macro photography of plants and insects, and I guess I'm good enough at it that I get the question, which is, what camera do you use? Or how do you take that photo? Or if I had your camera, I could take that photo. So to sort of address that question of how to get into macro photography and what are the techniques to get good photographs of small insects and flowers, I have 6 main points. And I'll go through them. Those are: number 1, patience; number 2, artistic vision; number 3, knowing the natural history of your subject; number 4, lighting; number 5 is lenses, so the way to get magnification; and number 6 is camera. And you'll note these are in the order of importance, at least in the order that I think they're most important. And you'll note that what camera it is at the end. Okay, so to go through those 6 points. Number 1 is patience. For most macro photography, you're dealing with, especially of insects, small subjects that are often moving and difficult to photograph. And also, because macro photography is at a small scale, you have very fine adjustments to make really big differences in a photograph. So that's all to say, it takes a long time to get the photo that you want, and a lot of fiddling and a lot of yoga moves and all sorts of things to get what you want. And you'll never get it if you're not patient enough to keep trying. And so the ingredient to all good photographs, and especially macro photography, is patience. So number 2 is artistic vision. I've thought of photography differently over the years, which is to realize that photography is very much an artistic interpretation of the world rather than a copy of the world. And so to get a good photo of something, it's not just that you have a neat subject or that you have the tools to do it, is that you need a unique vision in your head of what you want to create, and using those tools that you have to get that vision into your camera. And so that comes down to, a lot of that comes down to composition. And so knowing where you want your subject and what the background to be and what the lighting to be, all of that is an artistic vision that you use all of these tools, camera tools and flashes and lenses and everything to achieve that vision. So number 3 is natural history. I think of natural history as that comes in different forms. So one is knowing what your subject is and what you want to capture. So the best case scenario is you know what insect you want to photograph, you know something about it, you know its ecology, where it lives, what it eats, all these things. And so when you go to have that artistic vision, you can capture something about its natural history that's interesting and exciting. So having that background knowledge is ideal, but often we don't know. When I go out, I often don't know what I'm looking at. So I think there's a different side of natural history, which is often comes down to attention. And so if you're out and you're being attentive and you're taking the time to look at the subjects that are around you, then I think of that as part of natural history too. It's being a good naturalist, being aware and observant to find interesting things to photograph. And often if you know nothing about it, if you are there and you're attentive, you can watch it and find something about it, which will help you have an artistic vision of what you want to capture. So number 3 is lighting. It is possible to take macro photographs without a flash, but I found, and most people quickly find, that it's quite limiting. Natural light is harsh. And especially when you're dealing with small subjects, you'll get bright spots and shadows and all these things. And most macro photographers pretty quickly come to relying on flash for most of their photographs. And so this gets into a whole lot of options of how you could use flash. But I've gone to basically to the simplest form, which is using the flash that's on my camera, the pop-up flash. So that means that mostly what I use on my camera is this pop-up flash. There's lots of external flashes and fancier things, but I like to keep my setup as simple and light as possible. And that goes back to my point number 1. If my setup is simple and light, then I'm much more likely to have more patience to get the photograph I want. Because I often find that the patience is a more limiting factor of getting the good photograph than having, a specific heavy piece of equipment. So for lighting, then it comes down to you have the light source, and then you need to get the light source onto your subject. And in most cases in macro photography, that means diffusing the light. So in this setup I have here, my subject is very close to the lens. And if I have this tiny little flash up here, from the point of view of the subject, that's going to be like a big bright sun that's fairly far away, and it's going to create hot spots and it's going to create shadows. The goal is to turn your small light source into a diffuse light source, sort of mimicking like a cloudy day. So the way to do that is to diffuse the flash. And what I have is a flash diffuser that I made myself out of a milk jug, which is sort of opaque and diffuses the flash a little bit, but it's also just a good malleable thing that you can cut. And then I taped on there this semi-transparent diffuser paper. So it's actually sold as a flash diffuser product. You can find it online. I think it's made by Roscoe Lux or something like that. But you can use tracing paper, or even just notebook paper actually works pretty well too. So the goal is just to figure out a system where you can get your diffuser that's basically as close to your subject as possible. And so the closer it is to the subject, the more it's going to be like a cloudy day, getting light from all angles. So there's a lot of ways of doing it. This is the way I've figured out to do it. I just have it Velcroed to the front of my camera, and then it ends up being this sort of lid right over the subject. Number 5 is lenses and magnification. Well, you can't get macro photos if you don't have a lens that can sort of magnify your subject in some way. The most popular form of magnification is using a macro lens that's sold as a macro lens, and really popular one are like 100 millimeter or so macro lenses. And the main reason I think these are popular is because they give you some distance between your camera and your subject. And so when you have something that's going to run or fly away, that can be really helpful. The problem with having distance between your camera and the subject is that if you want to get good lighting, you have to then get your light over that subject, which is then far away from your camera. So for this lens setup, to get good lighting, I either find you're only doing the highest magnification where you're actually closer, or you're using a flash setup that's off the camera, which I don't like to do because it's too heavy. And I also find this lens too heavy to fiddle with. But it is a really great lens and good for macro stuff. And I mostly use it if I happen to be doing something with natural light or studio work, which I won't talk about today. But my main lens in the field now is actually using a lens that isn't intended to be a macro lens. It's actually just a wide angle lens. So the lens I mostly use is a 25 millimeter prime lens, wide angle lens. And this is an old manual focus, manual aperture lens, which is actually really helpful for a couple of reasons I'll explain in a minute. So this lens is a really, really excellent wide angle lens for taking, photos of landscapes and things. But it can be turned into a macro lens in 2 ways. The first way is to use an extension tube. An extension tube is just something that you screw into your camera. It doesn't have any glass in it, and it just puts distance between the lens and the sensor within your camera. And functionally what that does is it shortens the focal distance, or it shortens the minimum focus distance, so you can focus on things that are closer. So that just goes on the camera, and then the lens screws into that. And with this lens, it goes from having a minimum focus distance of about this far to a focal distance of about right there. So it's very, very close. So this gives a field of view, about this big. So like a big beetle can fit in the frame. And then this then works very well with my flash setup. So your subject is about right here, and then the flash is coming down right over it. And so that's for like medium-sized macro photography. The other way of turning this into a more powerful macro lens is to reverse it. And so I don't know if you've ever looked through binoculars backwards, but it turns into like a little magnifying glass. You can do the same thing with a lens. And what I have is a reversing ring that screws into the threads where you'd normally screw in a filter. And what it allows you to do is take the lens off and mount it on the camera backwards. So to do this, you do need to have a lens that functions manually, because if your lens is mounted backwards, the camera can't then adjust the aperture, because that happens through these little, levers on the back of the lens. You have to be able to adjust the aperture manually. So because this is an old lens, the aperture adjustment is manual. So with this, the focal distance is about the same as my other setup. It's right about here, and but the magnification is way higher. It's about this big. It's a little over a centimeter, so it's really high magnification. And you can actually then put extension tubes between the camera and the lens and get even higher magnification. So some of the really expensive lenses, like the Canon makes, that have up to 2x and 5x magnification, I can get basically that same level of magnification with this old lens I bought on eBay for like $50. And the other thing I really like about this setup is it means with one lens, a very light lens, I can have a great normal wide angle photo to take photos of landscapes. I can have a setup here that can take photos of medium-sized insects and flowers, and then reverse it to get very, very high detail and high magnification shots of even just like the face or the eyeball of an insect. So for me, this is by far my favorite lens setup, and it's basically all I use anymore. Okay, so for the final number 6 point is camera. I really don't think that cameras matter that much in macro photography, except that I do think you need an SLR. So that means a lens that has a mirror in it, so that when you're looking through the eyepiece, you're looking through the lens. There are cameras that function pretty well for macro photography that are called mirrorless, where when you look through the eyepiece, instead of looking through the lens, you're looking at sort of either a digital remake of it or just looking at the screen. And those can take really great photos, especially because some of them have the ability to put on different lenses. So there's not really any limitation in the photos they can take, but I think there's a big limitation in the usability, because if you're only looking at a screen, it's way harder to get on focus and get exactly the photo that you want looking at a screen rather than actually looking through the lens. So my small experience in using lensless cameras is that they can be good, but ultimately having a regular SLR is really important. Which SLR? I don't really think it matters that much. I have basically the cheapest SLR you can get, the Nikon D3200. The only limitation is this one is it's really noisy, and so I have to use a low ISO setting and compensate by having bright flash. So better cameras function really, really well at high ISO, and that can make you not so reliant on flash and use natural light more, and can help get sort of the background lighting and things. So that would be really nice, but ultimately you can compensate for that. So if your limiting budget is something to do with camera, I would just get the cheapest SLR you can get. The other fancy functions that come with more expensive SLRs really don't help you much when it comes to macro photography, because they often have to do with special features or autofocus and things like that. Okay, so that was my 6 points for macro photography. To summarize, number 1 is patience, taking the time and having sort of the fortitude to wait it out and get the photo that you need. 2 is artistic vision, and realizing that all of the tools that you have, or all the lenses and cameras and equipment you have, are just tools to get at the vision that's in your head. And so it's really an artistic process. Number 3 is natural history. So that's either knowing your subject, learning about your subject, or being very attentive in nature to learn about your subject on the fly. Because getting photographs that represent something about an organism's natural history will be the most interesting photos. Number 4 is lighting. And for macro photography, that mostly means using a flash and diffusing your flash. And that often comes down to some sort of DIY way of doing that in a way that works well for you. Number 5 is lenses and magnification. There's a lot of lenses that are good for macro photography, and ultimately that comes down to your style. And also what type of subject you want to get at. If you're really into butterflies and things, my setup isn't going to work very well because you have to get very close. But to experiment and figure out what lenses work best for you and become really well at working with that one lens in that one setup, because I think being an expert in your best setup is where you're going to get the best photos rather than mixing a bunch of different setups. And number 6, which is really not all that important for macro photography, is what camera you have. Except that I do think it's quite limiting to not having a digital SLR. I think that's it. I hope that was helpful.